All right, welcome back everybody. This is week 15 and it is the last presentation of the last bit of scripture from our last text study for the year 2022. So per usual, we're going to have a discussion, our last discussion of the last scripture of the last text study of 2022 here on Wednesday and on Zoom, and we'll record that as well. Now, there's no need for me to go through the themes for December, except I do want to point out one thing. When I laid out the themes, I wanted to show that the announcement to the shepherds is the third announcement in Luke's story. So first there was an announcement to Zechariah that he and Elizabeth would have a child. Then there was an announcement to Mary. And you'll remember that Zechariah seemed to have doubted, right? And was muted for a time as a result of that. Mary also asked a question. How can this be, seeing that I'm a virgin, right? The shepherds, notably, do not question the Annunciation. And I just wanted to point that out. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they don't question it. However, they do say, let's go see it. And I want to lift up for us whether that is an act of faith, hey, this happened, let's go worship, or whether it's an act of validation. We've heard this, now let's go see if that happens. So today we're going to focus on the shepherds visiting the babe. That's the story itself, and a lovely story in many respects. But I also want to ask the question, what's the relationship between the word and the reality? The message one hears, the validation. I think that connection between word and reality is very, very important throughout the scriptures, and particularly in this story. So at the end of our verse by verse, we'll circle back to this issue of the relationship between the word, the reality, the message, the validation, and so forth. Okay? All right. So let's start with a reading. Reading verses 15 through 20, just 6 verses. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. When they saw this, they made known what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, as it had been told them. All right. So here we go. Let's look at verse 15. This is a rather long verse and a lot taking place here, right? When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Now let us go to Bethlehem to see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." All right, first of all, notice that we have the plural of angels. And that's not a presumption. That is actually the word hoi, angeloi, the angels. So remember last week we noted that the phrase heavenly host could refer to angels, could refer to sun, moon, and stars, as it does in Acts chapter 7, verse 42. It could refer to many heavenly bodies. In this verse, Luke seems to be summarizing that as, yes, these are angels. So if I took your Christmas story away from you last week by suggesting that phrase could be translated heavenly bodies instead of angels, heavenly host didn't necessarily mean angels. I'm giving it back this week. Luke calls them the angels. Now Young's literal translation translates that as the messengers, so they could still conceivably be something other than angels, but that's true of all the angels. The only reason I raise this is not really to puncture our nativity scenes. as much as it is to just get us to think a little more expansively about how God is present in the world, and kind of get the stereotypical artistic representation of angels out of our head, because those are representations of something wonderful. And I just think we diminish them a little bit if we take them too literally. But these are angels, according to Luke, and the angels have gone back up into heaven. They were filling the sky, now they're back into heaven. So Luke's got some interesting cosmology at work here. But that's the first thing I wanted to see. The second thing is, look at what the shepherds say to one another. Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing. For us, thing is a noun, and it's an object, but that's a translation of the word rhema. Rhema, we've heard it before, and the word rhema literally means word. Rhema. So there are two words that are translated as word in the New Testament fairly commonly, and one would be logos or logo. That typically refers to something like an idea or even a written word, as it was spoken in the words of the prophet Isaiah and so forth. But then there's rhema, and rhema most often refers to like a spoken word. You could almost translate it message, proclamation, something like that. The New Revised Standard Version, which we are reading as our translation, has made this thing. Let's go see this thing that has been made known to us. So just notice that we have, I think it was Karl Marx, actually, who started this term, the thingification of words. Words are now things. They've been reified, as it were. And that's going to be important when we reflect on the relationship between the spoken word and the reality of something. So already in the translation, with the shepherd saying, let's go see this thing, the message, the words, and I'm going to use this very deliberately, all we have at this point are words to the shepherds. But they're now treating those words as a reality. That's very different from how we typically treat words, as just sounds, right? Phonetic things that dissipate into the air. Because sticks and stones can break our bones, but words can never harm us, right? Because they're not real. They're just things. They're just sounds. But here the presumption is, and I think the NRSV translation is not going beyond the first century mentality in doing this. The assumption is that words are things. Words mean something. Words matter. They're not just sounds that are disconnected from the reality to which they point. So we'll talk more about that as we go along. Just keep your eye open for that. So when they say, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing, what they're referring to are the words that were spoken by the angel to them. And that's what they're going to see. So you've heard the word, now you're going to go see the reality. Verse 16, so they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. Now in the Greek text, it's Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. It almost sounds like the three of them are squeezed into the manger there. And that could be a possibility if we interpreted that word manger as a stall or a stable. But at least we know the verb lying is in the singular form. So it's not all three of them spooned up together, sleeping after a long night. It is the child itself lying in the manger. So they went with haste. We have heard this word one other time in the English translation when Mary was visited by the angel, and then she left and went with haste to go visit Elizabeth. There, it's a noun, actually, that's being used almost like an adjective, that Mary went with haste. And my small lexicon, I haven't gotten out the big hairy one yet, but my small lexicon did not connect that noun with this verb, but I see a very clear connection between it, because here we have it in its verbal form. And it's actually as a participle. And it's the same word that Jesus uses in the story with Zacchaeus, when he says, Zacchaeus, hurry down out of your tree, for I must have lunch with you today. And the next verse says, Zacchaeus hurried down out of the tree. So this is really the verbal form, I think, of the noun that we saw earlier. So you get this sense that someone gets a message and then with haste goes to verify that message. There's kind of an urgency to it. So the hearing and the seeing, which Mary did with Elizabeth, and the shepherds are now doing with the babe, there's an urgent connection, not just a casual one could say. And maybe that's the role that this word with haste means. And again, the word manger, it doesn't occur often in Luke or the rest of the scriptures. It's not a baby crib, but it could be something like a corn crib or a feeding trough of some sort. It could be translated stall, as I said a moment ago, which would be a little more roomy and would in fact place Mary and Joseph and the baby in something like a barn or a stable. Or it could refer to the smaller container itself, where you might lay a baby if you repurpose this feeding trough into something like a crib. Jesus will use this word later to talk about leading an ass from the manger or stall to get water. So it does seem to be either a resting place or a feeding place, typically for animals. But remember, this is a sign, right? You'll find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger. So when they get there and they find the child lying in the manger, we don't have reference to the swaddling in this verse, but that's the sign that they were looking for. There's no star, no angels singing at the moment, no halos hanging over people's heads, no mysterious background lighting. How they found this family is not of Luke's interest to tell us. They just went to Bethlehem. They found the Holy Family. That word translated found is funny because when you look up the definition, it could say to come across something by accident or to come across something deliberately. And if it can mean both, I think it should just say to come across something and leave out the incidental or accidental nature of it. Okay, so this is great. This is great. This is the moment, right? The shepherds have heard. Now they find. They see. They confirm. Verse 17, and when they saw this, they made known what had been told them about the child. So, when they saw this, what do they see? What do they see? They see a man and a woman and a baby. They see a baby swaddled in cloths, which would not be, one reckons, very unusual. They see the baby lying in a makeshift manger. It could have been relatively common for poor people to do that. They could be out in the middle of a field. They could be in a barn. Could be in a cave. They could be in the little guest extension on the side of a house where animals are normally kept. We can study first century habitat arrangements and make guesses, but Luke is very sparse in the details. All we know is they saw this, a babe lying in the manger. That's what they were looking for. That's what they saw. And when they saw this, look at this phrase, they made known. They made known. Now, to whom? I want to ask that question. To whom are they speaking? if we look at our nativity creche, then it's the shepherds and it's Mary and Joseph, maybe a few animals hanging around until the Magi show up, which to hear Matthew tell it could have been 2 years later, and they were in a house. But here the shepherds arrive and they make known. So there's a preposition here, peri, which we know from using that as a prefix in the English language, means around, right? The perimeter, perimeter, is the measuring around something. Peri in Greek can either be a prefix, it often is, or it can be a preposition, which means around. All right? So when they saw this, they made known. Let me make sure I'm saying this correctly. They made known. That's the phrase that we see in the New Revised Standard Version. In the King James Bible and in Young's literal translation, they say they made known abroad. So they're honoring that preposition there. They made known abroad, not just they made known. If you leave it like the New Revised Standard Version does, they could easily be talking just to Mary and Joseph. But we're going to see in a minute why that's probably not the case. Okay? So the shepherds are making known peri, around, abroad. The New International Version has, they spread the word. That too would give you a sense that we're talking to more than just Mary and Joseph. So I think those translations are a little more on point with this phrase than the New Revised Standard Version. And the second time the word peri appears in this verse is they made known abroad about the child, concerning the child, around the child. They made known what had been told them, what they had heard about the child. Again, peri, the child, surrounding the child, what they had been told all about this child. So you can see in both of these instances, they made known peri, what had been spoken peri. So they had made known abroad what had been spoken about the child. I think the New Revised Standard Version really picks up on the second peri and kind of overlooks the first one, and which I don't think is very helpful. Because again, I have always heard this as the shepherds talking to Mary and Joseph. Jesus is lying in a manger. He's probably asleep. But Mary and Joseph, and it just feels like they're talking to them. But if you honor that first peri, there seems to be a broader audience. And we'll see that in the next verse. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. Now, if it's just Mary and Joseph, it'd been very easy for Luke to write, and the parents, or something like that, right? But all who heard it. So, as much as this may interrupt our normal vision of the creche, the nativity creche, there are more people than just Mary and Joseph in this story. And these are the folks to whom the shepherds are talking. Now, you might say, maybe they visited Mary and Joseph, then they started going around the town telling people that. It's possible, but we haven't really heard that they've gone anywhere. We're going to hear that in another verse or two. Right now, they just seem to be right there, sharing this news, but not just to Mary and Joseph. And maybe that's not a big deal, but that's different from how we often envision the story. And all who heard it were amazed. This is a great term. It's actually not passive, like we're amazed. All who heard it marveled. It's an active verb. It's the same verb we heard in the first chapter when Zechariah was in the temple for a long time and the people were out there waiting and they all marveled that it took him for so long to come out. It's the same thing that we heard in the latter part of that same story when Zechariah writes his name is John, and they all marveled that he wrote that instead of calling him Zechariah Jr. So this is one way you respond to something wonderful and surprising that's happened, and all who heard it are marveling here. We're going to see later in the same chapter 2, when Mary and Joseph take Jesus to the temple. We read this in worship this past weekend, and Simeon holds up the child and blesses God. Now dismiss your servant, for my eyes have seen, your salvation. It says in verse 33 that Mary and Joseph marveled at what Simeon said about the child. So that's a great term. We're going to see it also in chapter 4 when Jesus is speaking at his home church in Nazareth, and people are marveling at the wonderful words that come out of his mouth. It didn't last long in that chapter, but this is a common response to words of grace. Verse 19, but Mary. So if the all who marveled were Mary and Joseph, they could have just said, Joseph marveled, but Mary, so again, a broader group. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. Okay, so there are two verbs in this verse that I want to draw your attention to. You know that I'm someone who really likes the Greek prefix sin. I have a group of pastors that I call together every week for a drink and conversation, and I call it the synagogue, based on the word synagogue, which means a gaggling together. And I preached a series one time on the joy of living in sin, S-Y-N, because sin means together. And there are a lot of words in the scriptures that begin with sin. Synchronize is one of our words that starts with S-Y-N. That means time together, chronos, together, right? So I really love this word sin. And it can appear either as, again, a prefix or a preposition. And in this verse, it appears as a prefix twice. Now, it's a little confusing because it can be spelled a little bit differently depending on what it's prefixing to. So, for example, the first time we see it here is the word translated treasured, and that's sun or sin. There's no Y in the Greek language, so this is the same prefix. So sigma, upsilon, nu, sun, tereo. And tereo means to keep, to preserve, like a wineskin would keep wine. Or you would observe the commandments, keep the commandments in that respect. So this word is a keeping together. A keeping together. It could also mean something like to watch or to guard something, keep it in that respect. And so the New Revised Standard and almost every translation has chosen to translate that keeping together as treasured. And honestly, I think that's a lovely choice. It just that's just what you do when you want to keep something and you want to keep it together, okay? And she treasured all these words. And then the second verb also has the same prefix, but it appears a little differently because of the first letter of the stem that's connected to it. And so it's sum balo. It's translated pondered here in the New Revised Standard Version. But we've seen this word balo before. Whether it's been in, I don't know if it's been in this text study of Luke, but in our studies of Mark and some of the other studies we've done. This is a very common verb in the New Testament and in the Gospels particularly, and most literally, fundamentally means to throw. Balo means to throw. And you see it often, for example, when Jesus is casting out an unclean spirit or a demon, balo, ek balo, cast out. It comes with different prepositions, different prefixes, and here, so you have balo, which means to throw, and sum, a version of sin, which means together. Throw together. It's translated pondered in the New Revised Standard Version. I'm not sure if that's a great selection. Partly because in the first chapter, remember when the angel came to Mary and said, "Hail, you who are highly favored, the Lord is with you." The next verse says that Mary pondered these words. That's a different word. It's a different word. So I don't like a translation giving us the impression that it's the same word. She pondered there, she's pondering here. She may be a ponderous person, but this is actually a very different word than that one. She throws this together. Okay, so you've got two things happening here. And one is that Mary's treasuring all these words, right? The message from the angels, the message from the shepherd. She's treasuring all these words. So in some respects, she's a historian. That's what you do. You treasure the words that are communicated to you, right? You keep them for safekeeping, as it were. And she throws them together. She interprets them. She synthesizes them. Would probably be a more accurate way of sumbalo than ponder. She's working this out. What does this mean? What does this mean that I heard from the angel? What does this mean that they heard from the angel? What does this mean that Mary said? And later, what will that mean that Simeon will say? Right? So you got all of these different messages and words and descriptors about who this child is. And then you got the child itself laying right there in the manger, and she's putting it all together. Pondering is not a bad word, not a bad translation in and of itself. I just didn't want you to think it's the same as what we heard in the first chapter. So this is Mary. She's becoming the first historian and the first theologian of the church, the first one who treasures the things for safekeeping. May well be a resource for Luke. And she interprets. She throws them together. She makes sense of it all. And then the last verse. Then, the shepherds returned. So now we have them leaving, which is why I don't think they left the scene of Mary and Joseph to spread the word abroad. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen as it had been told them. All right. So the shepherds are glorifying God. This is a great word. Luke uses the word a lot as a verb, not nearly as much as the Gospel of John. That it's a very key term in the Gospel of John, particularly in Jesus' prayer in John chapter 17. So if you're curious, go read that. They returned glorifying and praising. This is what the angels did a little while ago, right? In verse 13 of this chapter, the angels were praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest." Well, now the shepherds join them. They're glorifying God and praising God for all they had heard and seen. So what just happened? Well, we can rule out that the shepherds didn't quite believe the words of the angels, and they had to go validate and verify this for themselves, because the angels said, "This will be a sign to you. You will find the babe." So they were really set out on this quest. And they were set out on a quest to find, which is a visual term, the babe wrapped, swaddled, and lying in a manger, which would be the verification, the realization of what they had heard. And so when the shepherds visit the babe, what we have is a discourse on the connection between word and reality. And I want to argue that this is something worth pondering yourself, okay? Remember how God is described in the creation story? And God said, "Let there be light." What's the next line? And there was light. So there's an immediate connection between what God says and what is, in fact. God says it, it is. There it is. In John's Gospel, he speaks about the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. And then down in verse 14, and the Word became flesh. Now that word is logos, not rhema. But again, it's the idea that this idea, this word, this symbol. Words are symbols that point to and participate in a reality in some ways. This word became the thing. So what we have is it's characteristic of God, and one would argue from John's Gospel of Jesus, that word and reality, what is said and what is, are not disconnected, but they are one. And you can rely on that connection between what God says and what is. And it raises questions, right, of what if our words became reality? What if the things we say were inherently connected to what is? I mean, would that be a good thing? Would that be a good thing? Would we be speaking into reality things that are loving and just and wonderful in our world? Or would it be something like the Midas touch, right? Where what we think would be this real blessing would actually be a curse. It causes us to think about how we use our words and how we intend our words to be really related to reality. And if we just hear words as simply words, sounds, disconnected from reality, then we can do what we want. But we can say what we want. But if we see an inherent connection, now we get it. You can't use God's name in vain. Because when you speak God's name, something should be happening. You can't bear false witness, because when you lie, you're disconnecting the word from the reality. That's a problem. So in this story, what we see is that connection of word and reality. The shepherds, having heard the good news from the angels, are now seeing the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. This is a great, great story for pondering the relationship between God's word and the reality with which we live. And we'll talk about that on Wednesday. All right? Good to see you. Thank you. Bye.